Hello everyone! This week we're going to talk about sociological research. First we started off talking about the ways that sociologists see the world, and now we're going to look at the ways in which sociologists go out and try to find out more information about it. What's the point of sociological research? Well, the point of doing this kind of research is to investigate and provide insights into how human societies operate. And that could be anything from sort of large-scale explorations to things as small as looking at the way things work in, say, your school cafeteria. So when we're trying to go about researching the world as sociologists, what we rely on is empirical evidence. And this is evidence that is corroborated by direct experience and/or direct observation. This is opposed to, say, logical evidence, where we try to deduce what would make the most sense in our universe. That doesn't necessarily give us a sort of sound scientific basis for sociological research. What we rely on is actual evidence that we can look to in order to sort of explain the world and perhaps prove or disprove our hypotheses. So when you take this empirical evidence, plus a small dash of the scientific method, which you may be familiar with from maybe previous projects in the natural sciences, and using some of the theory that we've gone over perhaps last week, all of that comes together to make up sound sociological research. So there is a reason why we need theory in particular, is because you can have a set of data, you can have an experiment, you can have a set of results for any given experiment, but a functionalist, a symbolic interactionist, and a conflict theorist, for example, might see this same kind of data in a bunch of different ways, right? So you need to have the theory first in order to sort of better refine what lens it is that you are going to use to see the world with. So let's look at the scientific method. Of course, this is a nice sort of little visual depiction of how our sociological research is conducted, and you might actually kind of recognize a lot of these steps, perhaps from work that you've done previously. So let's go over the steps in a little bit more detail. So when you're designing your study, and this relates directly to any design you might have for a study in the future, as well as the one that you're doing for this class, it has to be reliable, which means that any person that reads your study has to be able to replicate it and do the exact same steps that you did to see what kind of result they could get. So whenever you write your report, it has to be written with clarity so that anybody can actually read your report and go out and do the research without having to actually ask you what you did or for any extra details. Another element of good research design is validity, which is how well the study measures what it was designed to measure. So let's say that you wanted to design a study that involved seeing whether there is a correlation between the genre of movie you go to see in a theater and the kind of movie food that you get. In order for that research to be valid, the research has to look at specifically movie genre and the kind of movie food that's used. An unvalid, or sort of a not-so-valid version of that research would have a lot of sort of extraneous questions having to deal with things like time of day, or where they sat in the movie theater, and that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what your study is designed to measure. Okay, so make sure that when you are designing a research study, you go through only the steps you need to go through in order to study exactly what it is that you want to look at. So the first step is to ask a question, and this is the point of your discussion question. So think about what question you might ask and what topics you might want to look at. The whole point of a brainstorming activity is that there is no sort of silly question. There is absolutely kind of no silly thing you want to look at. We've had research projects in the past that look at anything from the treatment of women in hip-hop videos to even asking your own student population what they thought about, I don't know, twerking, right? So you can ask anything and try to figure out what exactly it is that interests you. You might be better able to develop that brainstorming activity once we go over the different kinds of methods you can use. When you do ask a question, it is important to have operational definitions. And what is an operational definition? It's used to define a concept in terms of physical or concrete steps it might take to objectively measure it. What does this mean? Let's go back to our example of the kind of movie and kind of movie food that you get. There we have two concepts, right? We have movie genre and we have movie food. So you have to create an operational definition of what a movie genre is and what movie food is. So for example, if you want to see if there is a relationship between whether somebody goes to see an action movie or a horror movie or an animated movie or perhaps a romantic comedy, you would have to define those terms. What makes a romantic comedy a romantic comedy? And what is the definition of movie food, right? Would it count if I snuck in a Thanksgiving turkey dinner into a movie theater, or does it have to be stuff that you buy at the movie theater proper? Does candy count? Does popcorn count? Do nachos count? Do the drinks count as part of the movie food experience? All of these things go into creating an operational definition for something. You might be surprised to learn that in previous semesters, we've actually had somebody try to come up with an operational definition of twerking. It matters. Your definitions matter. So this is a step that I won't necessarily ask you to do in your own research study, but if you do find it useful, then you can go right on ahead and include it. For step 2, it's to research existing sources. So when you figure out a question that you want to ask, you have to look at the ways in which this question might have been investigated before. And that means putting together a literature review, which is a review of any existing or similar related studies to the one that you're trying to go ahead and get over. So where can you go to find these existing sources? Google Scholar is a great resource. Your own library database at your own school would probably have a really, really good mix of journal articles that you might be able to check out. Even things like Amazon.com, where you try to do a search for popular works and whatever topic it is that you're going to investigate. And the works cited page of any journal article that you might find. So, especially if you get a sort of bunch of journal articles, academic articles that are citing this sort of one particular researcher or this one particular article, and they all sort of have that in common, it might be useful then for you to go to that original article and try to figure out why it is that that is so important for your own research project. Not necessarily going to ask you to do this for your own, but if you find it useful, you can go ahead and include it. The next step is to formulate a hypothesis. And what is a hypothesis? It's just an assumption about how two or more variables are related. And usually you have an independent variable and you have a dependent variable. The independent variable is the cause of the change, while the dependent variable is the effect, the thing that is changed. So let's take this hypothesis as an example. The greater the rainfall, the higher the rate of drivers using their hazards, which is something that I find extremely annoying. So the cause of the change here, the independent variable in this case, is the rainfall. That is the thing that is changed. The rate of drivers using their hazards, on the other hand, is the effect. That is the thing that is changed. So if we wanted to look at our movie genre and movie food example, you might say that the independent variable is the movie genre of choice, and the dependent variable is the movie food selected. Whenever there is a change in the kind of movie you're going to go see, there is a change in the kind of food that you will select to accompany that movie. Now, of course, not all of sociological projects and not all of your projects might even fall under these sort of guidelines and have a really strict hypothesis. Your project can also seek to have an interpretive framework, where rather than trying to prove or disprove a hypothesis, all you're doing here is you just want to understand a social world a lot better from the point of view of the participants, and this leads to a lot more sort of in-depth knowledge. The reading that I have assigned about interviewing women sort of points to the ways in which using an interview tactic and using proper interview tactics, you can seek to understand more about the world. Now, the researcher definitely has a strong effect on the actual research. Sometimes they might have too much of an effect on the research, and one of those effects is called the Hawthorne effect. And this is where, quite simply, people change their behavior because they know they're being watched, right? And this comes from a study where there was a factory and they wanted to see how it was that they can improve productivity in the factory. A couple of researchers went in and they announced that they were doing a research study on the factory and productivity levels, and they increased how bright the lights were in the factory, and to see if maybe being able to see better could make people more productive. Turns out, what do you know? People became more productive. The problem is that as soon as the researchers left, they kept the lights nice and bright, but productivity dropped back down again. So the change wasn't necessarily the lights being brighter, the change was the researchers being present. Because the researchers were there, I guess the factory workers wanted to impress them, and so they upped their productivity, which completely messed with the results of the study in the first place. So think about this. What kinds of things can you do to limit the Hawthorne effect? A couple of them might include, well, just not saying that you're a researcher at all, which has its upsides and downsides, which you might get to later. And another thing would be to tell people that you're doing research, but don't tell them exactly what the research is going to be about. As an example, there may be an experiment conducted where you want to test, say, the effects that playing a video game has on a person's self-esteem. So what you might do is, you might have somebody do a study, do a little survey about their self-esteem, and then you send them to another room so that they can wait in this room while you process the results. While they're sitting in that room, there might be somebody who's helping you out with the research, playing a video game in some sort of waiting room, and they ask the person to join in. If the person ends up joining in, they end up playing the game for about 15 minutes, and once the person comes out, then they're asked to do the survey again. Now, the person may not know that playing the video game is part of the study, see? And that way, their results may not necessarily be affected. So those are some ways we can kind of circumvent the Hawthorne effect. Now, the kinds of methods that you can use are usually differentiated between quantitative methods and qualitative methods. Quite simply, quantitative methods have to do with numbers and statistics. So if you are able to say something like, oh, 50% of the people that I interviewed thought that twerking was awesome, then you are performing some sort of quantitative research. Qualitative research is more subjective, and it's based on what is seen in a natural setting. So qualitative research would be things like a participant observation or perhaps interviews rather than a strict sort of survey or kind of statistical analysis. So let's look at surveys. One method that you can use is a survey. And a survey is quite simply a questionnaire to gauge behaviors and opinions. And for example, one of my previous students actually had a survey and doled it out around campus to see what it is that their fellow students thought about twerking, and if they thought it was a good thing or if they thought it was a bad thing. Now in this case, the population there is the entire sort of the entire high school community, right? That is the entire population. And the population is just the people who are the focus of a study. So you want to know what, say, Doral Academy students think about twerking. And that is the entire population. However, think to how many people are actually in your school, and that is a lot of people, and you're not going to make that many surveys. So what you would do is you would take a sample, which is just a manageable number of subjects who represent the larger population. It has to be big enough to be representative, because in a school of 3,000 students, I'm not necessarily going to believe responses from only 2 people. At the same time, it has to be manageable, right? It can't be too large. So a representative sample of 3,000 people might be 2,000 people, but it's still not very manageable for you. So one of the key things to remember when taking a sample is that you should always work as much as possible for the sample of people to be random, where every person in a population has the same chance of being chosen. So a way that you can do this is, say that you have a population of 3,000 students, and for the purposes of our project, you want to select about 20 people. What you could do is, you could get a list of every single person in the school, and go to a random number generator online, and have it spit out random numbers. And then whatever number you spit out, say you have a list of 3,000 people, and the random number generator online spits out the number 372. Well, you go down the list, and whoever 372 is, you will select them. You can use a random number generator, you can roll a die, you can pull numbers out of a hat, whatever you can do in order to ensure that the sample is random. That way you can eliminate as much bias as you possibly can. So the potential benefits of surveys is that you can get your answers almost immediately, and it can be anonymous, so that, you know, people can fill these things out on their own time, and they don't necessarily have the pressure of being watched by a researcher. At the same time, there is the possibility of people not necessarily understanding your questions. If they're worded vaguely, they might answer, they might feel like they're answering incorrectly, or they might feel like they want to write down the right answer rather than what is an honest answer. And there's sort of no guarantee that if you give out 20 surveys, you're going to get 20 back in time for you to have your research project, right? And there's also no opportunity, unless you sort of build it in, there's very little opportunity for, if somebody gives you an answer that you think is interesting, there's very little opportunity for you to go back and say, oh, well, what did you mean by this, right? When you give out a survey, you can't necessarily see how it is the person reacts to that question, which might be just as important as asking the question itself. You don't know their body language, you don't know if they're offended, if they're intrigued, if they know what you're talking about. So there are benefits to surveys, and there are also some cons to them. Interviews, on the other hand, are just one-on-one conversations between the researcher and the subject. And these allow for you to be a lot more in-depth. If you can talk to one person for an extended period of time, you can definitely get a lot of information, as well as all of the stuff I mentioned before, like things like body language, the tone, and how it is that they say certain things. And it gives you the opportunity right then and there to ask them, oh wait, well you said this thing, which is really, really interesting, what did you mean by that? So that's a good benefit of an interview. A potential pitfall of an interview is that if you are one-on-one with the person, then, you know, you'll know exactly who answered what, which means that the person might be compelled to say the right answer, or to not be offensive, or not be controversial, instead of being honest, right? So there's a really strong potential for the Hawthorne effect. In field research, This is where you as the researcher could interact with or observe a person or people, and you can gather data along the way. So some examples of field research are some of the research that I conduct when I go to gaming conventions and to watch how it is that people play a particular video game. So I interact with and observe people, and I gather data along the way. That is what my field research is. And what we're trying to see is correlation but not causation. One of the sort of key things that you learn is that just because you see two things happening together doesn't necessarily mean that one of them is causing the other. Did you know that that there is a correlation between higher ice cream sales and greater incidences of drowning deaths? You didn't? It's true. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the more you sell ice cream, the more people are going to die by drowning, right? It just means that these two things are happening together. What do these things have in common? They both have a tendency to happen in the summer. Higher ice cream sales because it's hot, and higher drowning deaths because more people spend time in the water because it's hot in the summer months, right? So, just because two things happen together doesn't necessarily mean that they cause one another, which is a really important thing to look at when you're performing any kind of research, like participant observation, where you can join people and participate in a group's routine activities. It's all about experiencing a part of social life. So let's say that you wanted to investigate the group dynamics of your school cafeteria. Instead of just sort of standing back and taking notes, maybe you would go ahead and get lunch, join a group, and have conversations with people. And observe along the way and take notes, right? In this process, you might say that you're doing research and you might not, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, depending on which one. So the good thing about disclosing that you're a researcher is that, you know, everybody knows up front what it is that they're getting when they're interacting with you. And they know ahead of time that whatever they say will be used for research. On the other hand, it might make it so that people's activities are maybe less than genuine or authentic because they know they're being watched. On the other hand, if you don't say that you're a researcher, then when they find out later, the people that are being researched can feel betrayed and feel used and definitely feel very hurt. They can feel exploited, like they didn't have a hand in the process and everything was out of their control. So there are good things and bad things about disclosing who they are as a researcher and the purpose of their research. So it's something really important to keep in mind if this is something that you decide to do. Ethnography might not be something you decide to do for the purposes of this class, but it is a really important part of social science work. And what ethnography is if you stay in one place for a really long time, and you get a really in-depth analysis of an entire community. So rather than, say, investigating group dynamics in the cafeteria, or maybe just going to a pep rally, you are looking at the entire school community and how that works. And that not only involves the cafeteria and the pep rally, it's also how classes are organized, what people wear, how people interact, where they interact, what kinds of extracurricular activities are available, perhaps where people hang out after school, and what places around the school are popular with the students. All of those things can be taken into account when you're performing an ethnography. Another thing that researchers do often is an autoethnography, which is where they examine themselves. And this might seem a little silly because it's sort of, you know, people might sort of wonder what the difference between an ethnography and a biography is. But one interesting thing is that the researcher does not exist in a bubble, completely separated from the research they do. And the thing about pretty much all research, whether it's in the natural sciences or the social sciences, there is varying levels of objectivity here. And no one thing is very strictly objective. Me as a sociologist, if I go and perform an ethnography of your school, I will have an entirely different experience than if you did it being a member of that school. So oftentimes, as part of the research, it is very important for the researcher to examine themselves and what their relationship to the research is, and how they are affected, and how they can potentially affect the research that they do. Another thing you can do is a case study, which is a really in-depth analysis of a single event, situation, or individual. And you can use a whole bunch of methods to study one thing. So let's take the example of a pep rally. If you wanted to perform a case study of a pep rally, then perhaps you can go to this pep rally and perform participant observation, where you just go, participate, and observe the way that people act and what kinds of things take place during the pep rally. You can interview people after the fact, maybe people that perform during the pep rally, and see how they felt about that whole situation. You can also maybe conduct a survey before and after the pep rally, testing people's school spirit and whether it increased, stayed the same, or decreased as a result of the pep rally. You can do all sorts of things to examine just this one event. The problem with a pep rally, the problem with a case study, of course, is that just because a pep rally occurs one way in your particular school doesn't mean you can generalize and extrapolate, and it means that things will happen that way in every single other school. So it's not really generalizable, but it is a really good way of providing really, really deep analysis of one particular situation. Then another thing you can do is perform an experiment. And this is really useful if you have a hypothesis that has really concrete independent and dependent variables lined up. And there are lab-based experiments where you can sort of control all of the aspects of the environment, like for example the video game study that I mentioned previously, where you went into a room, had somebody take a survey, they play a video game for 50 minutes, and then they take a survey again to see if there is any change. That was a lab experiment. Other experiments are natural or field experiments, and one really popular example of those is a breaching experiment, and that's actually the kind of research that is most often done in my class when I assign this project. And the whole point of a breaching experiment, it's really, really fun, and it's all about breaking a social norm. So there are social norms, social rules governing everything from personal space to eating habits, to ways to greet and interact with other people, how you treat strangers versus friends, all sorts of fun stuff like that. And what a breaching experiment does is it examines what happens when you break those social norms. If you look up examples on YouTube, there are a lot of them. Some of them are singing in a crowded cafeteria, asking strangers for free hugs, asking people about what kinds of groceries they're getting and then walking away mid-sentence, looking the quote-unquote wrong way in an elevator. One of my students in a previous semester actually breached urinal etiquette by striking up a conversation with people next to him at the urinal. All sorts of things. So, of course, this is the point of the brainstorm. Come up with some really cool ideas, but definitely clear them with me, because breaching experiments can definitely have a potential to either be dangerous or get people angry with you. So let's make sure that you're not potentially breaking any laws or putting yourself in danger before performing any of these. But going to look at breaching experiments are kind of a nice little laugh. If you do perform a breaching experiment, what I would suggest is having a partner with you to actually videotape the whole thing sort of on the sly. because once you are sort of in the moment of breaking the social norm, you may not be able to pay attention to every single person's reaction to you, but if you're able to get it all on video, then you can actually look in great detail about how it is that people are reacting to you after the fact. So look some up. It's good fun. Then last but not least, you can also perform some secondary data analysis. And what makes it secondary is that you didn't collect the data, you are just analyzing it. So this can be pre-existing work from other sociologists or historians or teachers. You can look at census data and try to interpret it in a unique way. Or you can also look at sort of cultural products and do analysis of those, like newspapers, magazines, movies, ads, etc. And one popular one would be looking at magazines and looking at the advertisements and seeing what kinds of advertisements are in certain magazines. You can also look at the previews in a movie theater and see what kind of previews are there and what kind of messages those are sending. One popular one that I will mention now, just because it's quite timely, the Super Bowl and Super Bowl advertisements, and what Super Bowl advertisements have to say about what is important in our society, right? The good thing about secondary data analysis is that it's non-reactive, so there's very little opportunity to trigger the Hawthorne effect. You're not directly contacting any subjects, and you're not invading anybody's privacy or anything. You're just analyzing works that are already kind of in the public domain. And one sort of key one here is content analysis, which is another popular one for my students to conduct, which is basically they analyze a certain work and they kind of do counts. And for example, they'll take a series of magazines within 1 month or one magazine over the course of a year and analyze how many weight loss ads there are, and see if the number changes depending on the season. Or maybe you will take hip-hop videos within a certain time period and see how women are depicted, right? And see if you can form different sort of categories of ways that women are depicted in hip-hop music videos. You can perform all sorts of different kinds of content analysis, and that is actually a really, really popular research study. So that's another thing to consider. And it's especially pretty easy to do because you're not necessarily relying on other people in order to do it. So, with all of these things in mind, I want you to go back and sort of revise your discussion question so that you can really try and narrow down what kind of project it is that you want to take on for the purpose of this semester. I'm very much looking forward to seeing your projects, and we'll see you next week.